Okay.
All right, I'm double recording just to make sure. So,
All right.
how is your day so far? Everything all right?
Keeping busy. Yep.
Keeping
I'm
busy.
doing okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I actually woke up again thinking that this meeting was happening in the morning, but once again I switched the plus minus 6 hours sign. But it doesn't matter. Well, in any case,
If
let me.
only though, if only the flat earthers were correct, eh? None of these things would be an issue.
Who says they aren't?
Ah,
All right, so Matt, officially bid you welcome to the Nexus. And I would usually say that Matthew Area requires no introduction, but since I am in Switzerland, attempting to build an audience, I'm going to attempt to give you an introduction nevertheless. So Matthew Area is a generalist, which makes him, as far as I can see, a dying breed. And what I mean with generalist is that he has written about science, politics, epistemology, humanity in the broader sense, but also geopolitics and so on, like a very broad spectrum of insane knowledge behind that screen. So about a year ago, Matthew did a podcast on the Duran, which, to those who don't know, is the biggest podcast on geopolitics in the world. And that's why you flew into my radar for the first time. And the Alexes who host the Duran, they praised you as one of the greatest geopolitical analysts out there, not to mention that they called you a wizard and a genius. So once again, Matt, welcome to the Nexus, and it's a pleasure and honor to have you here.
hey, Mark, thank you for that very generous introduction. I think that they were being a little bit too generous. I don't know where some of that came from, but I was very moved by what they said. So yeah, I don't know about wizard, but but I tried to do my best. So I'm glad to be here with you.
Awesome. I will obviously put the links to CanadianPatriot.org, which is Matt's website, in the description box below, alongside any other links you want to push forward to me. And I was originally thinking of dividing this podcast into two parts, where in the first part, I wanted to ask you a few questions, which some you might have already answered in other podcasts, but others I was thinking of a very specific thing. And depending on the time we have and on your wish, I also wanted to talk to you about science and epistemology, which is, I think that we might have slight difference of opinions there, and that would be very fascinating, especially since I am someone who absolutely loves debating. But I was advised by emotionally smarter people than myself to keep it to the geopolitics and maybe keep it maybe for another episode to talk about epistemology.
Okay.
So depending on the time we got, I assume you have around about an hour.
Yeah.
Maybe?
Yeah, thereabouts.
All right. So let me start off with the history and geopolitics part then. So I believe, as far as I can read and see your works regarding, I don't know, Ukraine, China, the multipolar world, and so on, that we agree on a lot. Like there's again, from someone who loves debating, it's too much agreement for my taste, but no, I love it. I just love it. So since I'm still building my audience, and they might not be down the rabbit hole of geopolitics as we are, and certainly you are, I would like us to like zoom in on the current situation. And so my first question to you would be, how would you, in your own words, summarize the current pivotal moment in history we find ourselves in, with being on the brink of the multipolar world, this historic shift that we're living through, the wars, and how would you summarize the geopolitical situation in general? And more pertinently, second part of the question, why should people care? Why should everyday people care? Yeah.
That's a great start. I like that. And bringing in the subjective element is always very important, because I think we often, just having been born into an already, let's just say, a cultural dynamic which fell off of, I think, a more healthy trajectory, much more befitting of a productive, creative human civilization. We already kind of, as younger people, were born into an already kind of out of whack, disjointed orientation. We tend to be encouraged to see ourselves as voyeurs, consumers, consuming things, whether it's in the material or in the information domain. You know, we all experience wasting many an hour on social media, just looking for the next blip of something interesting.
I need that instant gratification, yeah.
Yeah. Got to get those. Yeah, exactly. So all that to say, I think the bringing in of the subjective element is super important, because we are all living in history. both as an objective process, but it's also a subjective thing, and it's also affected by matters of decision that we either, you know, making the decisions that we have made to do something about the process that we are learning more and more about is a factor in also what is going to shape in some fashion the outcome, to varying degrees of amplitude. Of course, we can't all have like, we can't all be John F. Kennedys or Ben Franklin's, but all that to say, if we choose to either act or not act according to what we know, which also involves matters that are a little bit more metaphysical, like courage, senses of honor, things like that. These are all like these very, you can't
Civil
really,
responsibility.
yeah, exactly. These are things that are a bit more nonlinear, but very real. And so we have to think about what is our relationship to that process that we came into and that we are going to contribute to before we die, because we're all gonna, that's one guarantee, we're gonna die. So all that to say, geopolitically, I think historically we are in a moment of what I guess you might call a pregnant moment, um a moment of heightened potential. I think that the idea of thinking of history as a physical process is a very useful thing in my mind as an exercise, because we often have been trained to think of history as sort of like something that occurs on some abstract timeline as events that just occur.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of mental artifacts that come in with this fallacious notion of history, involving, like, this idea of almost empty space in time, that there's that events that had to deal with, like, let's say, for example, 9/11, which was separated by over 24 years or 23 years from today's world, is so disconnected. Many of the people who were involved with 9/11 are not even alive today. So you can't say that there's a connection between the events of, let's say, the pandemic that justified the shutdown of the world economy back in 2020. It's totally disconnected, or even the murder of JFK in 1963. People will often say, "Oh, but that's so disconnected from 9/11." And today's world, it's a totally different thing. And they compartmentalize these very pregnant moments in history, which had a huge reverberation. And I found a very useful exercise in seeing things more like, I guess, as a metaphor. When I say pregnant moment, you could sort of see a twig or like a branch bending and bending and bending, and you could arithmetically calculate like sort of a constant bend, and it seems like there's like an arithmetic function of just like one moment to the next moment, but it's not those moments are not equal. Right? There's a pressure building up in the apex of the twig, and at a certain point it'll break.
And then it
And
gets
at those,
non-linear.
yeah, so I like that metaphor. There's other kinds of metaphor that people could create on their own, in their own minds, but that, I think, is sort of the breaking point that we are currently living through as a process.
Yeah.
It's influenced again by decisions to embrace bad ideas that we should have known better, but we chose to
We
embrace
chose
them
other ways.
anyway.
So
To be polite, and I think that we have, unlike, let's say, 13 years ago, um, a new potent dynamic. When I look at the multipolar alliance, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's a controlled opposition. It's a fake sense of hope." I don't see that. I look at the operating system and how decisions are being made, how the rules of the game are wired. When I look at
wait,
policies,
before we go into
yep.
the multipolar world, if you may just in 2 minutes or whatever, so it floats your boat, give like a short summary of the position, because many people might still not be familiar with the term multipolar world in Switzerland. So maybe just do this, where we are and where we're headed.
Okay, so I guess multipolar is a term that's been floated about more and more over the past. I guess I started seeing the earliest evidence of the term maybe in the late 90s
Oh,
by
wow, okay.
Primakov. Was somebody who, Yevgeny Primakov, was the prime minister of Russia in the 90s. He was an early patron of Putin, and he was an organizer of what became the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the later G20. So the concept might have been earlier. I think it was, but that word I started seeing floating about, and it became more normalized after I guess 2013. People started, I guess, kicking it about a lot more as a juxtaposition to another idea, which is unipolar. What type of operating system would govern the type of rules that the world would be shaped by, and would it be one center of command that will make an edict over what would be the global patterns of behavior and the rules shaping those from one central command point? Or would there be some idea of multiple poles in the world? This idea of respecting, well, that's a bit more difficult, because then you have to presume that we can use deliberation and reason if multiple poles are all working together to come to agreements about what rules will be shaping the world.
It,
That
it,
that
it's akin to a centralized authority like totalitarianism and democracy, where you have decentralized people deciding jointly, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, in an abstract sense. I mean, of course, you're still dealing with sovereign nation states that will use the power of sovereign central government authority to make decisions. So it's not like perfect democracy from a totalized,
Yeah.
decentralized standpoint, obviously. But as an abstract idea, sure. Um,
Also,
and this is
also not
where
everyone has the same weight, right? These nations. So yeah.
no, no, exactly. Not every. There's no two things that are equal. Maybe in the mathematical world, there are two things that can be equal, but in the real world, we don't ever find like two snowflakes that are exactly equal. So it's same thing for like nations as well. There's always going to be certain gravitational power over, let's say, China will have, by virtue of it just being a giant powerhouse of an economic player, it'll have more of a gravitational effect than, let's say, Laos, and it doesn't mean that Laos shouldn't have a positive effect, but it's not going to be as much of a player as a China. But but the question is, does China choose to look upon the smaller gravitational forces in their orbit as something that they must control and dominate? Or do you allow for a way of thinking that presumes that these smaller powers can participate in a win-win perspective, which benefits everybody? And in the
Uh,
West, we used to have sort of a similar philosophy that was active in some way in our geopolitical or foreign policy, and it's been really gone. Like there's not a lot of influence or evidence of that sort of JFK type of open spirit that we had seen with his approach to Ghana or to Africa. That was much more. He knew that he ran the United States, or no, he was the head, or the elected representative of the United States, the most powerful nation in the world. He knew that he could like boss little guys around, and he could feasibly use the economic and military power to exploit the world. He knew he could do that, but he chose to have a different attitude. And you could see that in his policies towards helping the industrialization aspirations of Africa, of South America, and other things, which I think also contributed to his short run as a president as well.
Yeah,
um,
that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go
yeah.
into. So you mentioned China. I have a question on China, and I'm hesitant to ask it now, but I think I would like to ask this one before, which is, so I believe we can agree that there's a lot of powerful elites running the show, that there's that there's way less popular influence on the political stage, especially when it comes to international policy and geopolitics, than one might think, especially for someone like me who just, but in school we were taught that we just vanquished totalitarianism, we abolished monarchy, and now we finally reached this pink, glorious land of peoples, republics, and democracies, right? And so, in light of that, I wanted to ask you about those elites. Who exactly are the elites? Is it, according to you, is it the people like the Rockefellers? Is it the Klaus Schwabs of the world from the World Economic Forum? Is it some organization like the Freemasons? Is it just some random billionaires who just happen to have sway today, but tomorrow there'll be another one? Like, who is running the show, or at least who is writing the rules?
That's a big question. Yeah, I can contribute my opinion about that. Um, I think the way I have come to think about this process, because it's not like it's not a straightforward answer. Some people want to have like, oh, it's the protocols of Zion, it's all in there. It's obviously, Jewish Freemasons or something. Like, no, it's there's not just like one simple way to approach this. But I think that there are a limited array of families that have maintained a continuity through the assistance of certain fondies, like they're called family funds, that also involve properties of castles, massive properties that you're born into if you're part of one of these upper crust families that can, in some cases, like the Orsini family, like there's a few cases that I've looked at that can trace their family lineage back to some of the leading emperors of Rome, of the Roman Empire. It's a thing. Like, it's verifiable that this is a thing. They can go back to a few of the doges as well of Venice. Venice was one of the dominant economic and military power, mostly economic powerhouses of the world for like 800 years, between the First Crusade all the way to Napoleon's takeover and dissolution of Venice as the dominant sort of economic power. But so there are a limited array of families. They have an associated amount of, I think, institutions that sometimes will be they're very adaptive. So the organizational structures that will be used to express the influence of the higher, or oligarchy, you could call it, like it's a very closed oligarchy. Like they're not gonna welcome very easily new families into the inner core. Very closed. In that sense, somewhat different from the Chinese oligarchy, because China also has oligarchies, or an oligarchy, but it's a little bit more of an open oligarchy. It's more influenced by the meritocratic Confucian system, which is not really there in the Western oligarchy, so it's a much more closed thing, which is interesting. And so, yeah, certain Freemasonic groups will be used. But not all Freemasonic groups are bad, and not everybody who's a Freemason even knows what they're a part of. You see evidence of different battles within lodge systems over the centuries, right? We saw that with the United States, right? There were certain Freemasons working to make the American Revolution happen, and there were certain Freemasons working to subvert the American Revolution, and the same thing for its expression in Europe, in Austria, in Vienna, in France. There was no coherence in all of the lodges. So
let
that's
me
important. Yeah.
let me piggyback two questions on that. One, do you think it is that interfighting between the lodges which generates this room for actual change? Whereas if they were all single-mindedly pursuing one totalitarian goal, say, of absolute power, we would actually be in a bad place?
Well, I don't know exactly. Definitely what I could say, because like today, do I see any evidence today of like noble actions emanating from the current lodges that are active within the United States or in most of Europe? I don't see that sort of evidence in the measurable world of policy actions and their outcomes. I just don't see so much of that. It doesn't mean that there are that again, there might be good Freemasons who are on the lower rungs, in the lower degrees, who are just good people. I think the majority of Freemasons are probably good people who just don't know what's going on in the higher degrees. There's something that happens along the way that I've never experienced, and I'm sure that they can do and do good efforts at different times when faced with conscience. I think historically, though, that's my domain. Is I've been more comfortable looking at this process as a historical phenomenon. I have seen more evidence of these fights going back to the times of the American Revolution, of throughout the 19th century, even into the 1920s and 30s. I've seen more evidence of these battles between the lodges in the West. But to get back to your original question, I think that it's not just that, right? Because when I look at, well, what characterizes one of the more positive lodges that, let's say, a Benjamin Franklin or a Marquis de Lafayette or a Mozart is a part of, with the with the oh, I forgot the name. Anyway, what characterizes the more positive, influential lodges versus those that are trying to undermine the good? I noticed that there's an idea of making what some would wish to be esoteric knowledge become intelligible to the masses. So, for example, in Mozart's lodge, there was a science journal associated with that lodge system that Mozart was a part of. Keep in mind, his magic flute is not. It's got some very interesting concepts within the magic flute if people watch it, and it was written in 1790 as well. This is during a time of heightened Republican sentiment across Europe, hoping to follow the in the
French.
footsteps of the example of the U.S. example, and the French Revolution had not yet turned into a violent bloodbath yet. So there's still a lot of hope that maybe this could turn out better. And if it were successful in France, then you look at it in Ireland, in Poland, in Germany, or various parts of Prussia. There was a similar hotbed of Republican fervor to establish a new type of order based upon the consent of the governed instead of hereditary elites, these sorts of things. So all that to say, there was a scientific journal, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but within it, it was basically it was for popular consumption, and it was taking sacred geometrical ideas and rendering it accessible and intelligible to the minds of any person who has not given up the use of their reason. Um, so things, basically like the golden section. How do you construct the pentagon? Like what are these things that are very easily mystified? If you're just simply, you know, a mathematician, these things become a little bit mystified because they're not expressible on a linear on a linear one-dimensional thing. But it makes perfectly good sense when you construct a pentagon. You start realizing what the golden section is as a qualitative process of creation in your mind, and you can trace back, going from ignorance to knowledge, of how that pentagon is created. And then you could like look at its relationships to the square, the triangle that's also perfectly inscribed within a circle of a common size or a common radius, and you can start discovering how your mind works in that process, which is what a lot of these Masonic lodges that were better were sort of doing, which is a bit of a heresy for those who would rather keep these things secret. Yeah.
So let me add a question to what you were saying before, because I'm someone who considers myself more or less educated in history, right? Like I followed this, I've read dozens of books and so on, but I have yet to come across, I haven't come across as much on the topic of Freemasons, like you mentioned it. And when I have, it was usually in the context of what I would call a conspiracy theory, right? But if I have learned anything upon reading and studying history, it's that usually, whatever the event is, the most craziest conspiracy theorists are usually the ones who are right in the end. So yeah, like I don't want to taint the notion of Freemasons as a conspiracy theory in any way. I just want to preface it like that, right? Sure. So would you tell us what is this Freemason organization? You spoke of multiple lodges. Is it something like an official organization where you get a ritual, where you get taken into? Do you get like a certificate, or is it more like a network?
Yeah, well, it's not homogenous. It's heterogeneous in a large degree, or maybe less heterogeneous today than it might have been a century or 2 centuries ago. But it's still, there's many different types of lodges. I would say that the Freemasonic sort of system is tied to something that does go back a long ways.
Okay.
It probably originated in Egypt during a period. Geopolitics is geopolitics. There's always been kingdoms, vying empires, rivals, and the need for state secrets, the need to keep breakthroughs that you make from getting acquired by one of your rivals. And so I think that it's likely the case that in the context of constructing some of these extraordinary temples and in some cases observatories of ancient Egypt, of which we have the Pyramid of Giza and many other fantastic constructions, there would be certain discoveries made along the way regarding um, the cycles of the precession of the equinox, other things which informed the planners, the engineers that set the blueprints for some of the pyramids, not all of them, as far as like how they were calibrated to certain discoverable patterns in the heavens. And I think that there's certain associated technologies, and I'm not here talking about ancient laser beams or anything like that. I just mean that there's certain breakthroughs that you would be able to make, which could give you an edge over your ancient rivals that you would want to keep secret. And I think you would want to have people only who you could trust on the receive some of the knowledge of how to do or to understand certain things about reality. And so the degrees of I think initiation probably originated from something like that. You know, the need to
Mm-hmm.
find and to filter out people who are capable of receiving or becoming trusted to receive and keep secret state secrets that are scientific in nature and maybe philosophical. There's might be certain philosophical things, and I think it probably got corrupted over time. As you know, as soon as you introduce secrecy, secret knowledge, it could easily become corrupted.
Yeah, you give it an end date basically, because sooner or later it might come out.
You know, exactly. So certain power is wielded with that type of secrecy, and probably more degrees were added to it. All that to say that the idea of these mystery groups pervaded all of the ancient world in Babylon, Persia, Greece. There's always these mystery cults that started forming. Um, Not really to good effect.
So, so
Yeah.
if I may, would you say it's fair to define the Freemasons like, how should I put it, like an umbrella organization? No, like a multitude of organizations that developed throughout the different cultures of humanity, say Egypt, as you gave it an example, or I don't know, medieval Europe or revolutionary Europe, or the United States as they were created. And every time you have an organization like a state, you usually have a group of initiates, and those are Freemasons. It's not like an umbrella group that are all tied together throughout the world. It's more like an overall term to designate the initiated. Is that fair, or am I misunderstanding it?
Something that, like, before the American Revolution, there were active lodges. A lot of them were used by by the British Empire. That's one of the ways that they were able to coordinate imperial intrigue. I mean, the British Empire
Mm-hmm.
was a little island, you know, but able to maintain and control over 25% of the world's surface area. Part of that involved epistemological warfare, understanding how do you play people against each other. There's certain tricks of the trade
Yeah.
uh, that has been passed on and crafted and honed to get people to destroy themselves or to stay divided with themselves as individuals or as communities or with their neighbors. So there's different simple, relatively simple yet still complex. I don't want to oversimplify it, techniques to do that. And the lodge system has been useful at maintaining systems of empire, but at the same time, I think due to possibly the distance maybe from the old corrupt systems of Europe, the you know the young colonies had a space whereby people like Ben Franklin or Cotton Mather or others were able to
Splinter off.
um, breathe a little bit, plan a little bit outside of the immediate grip where actions could be undermined very easily if they were too close to the British Empire's central basing up of operations, as many Irish Republicans had discovered over the years, who tried
Mm.
to resist British edicts, and they were so close. It didn't last long.
Yeah.
So I think that when it comes to the lodges, part of it was practical. Like you got to keep secrets as if you're going to organize a conspiracy to make something as big as an American Revolution happen, which takes many years of planning. It takes a lot of coordination. There's no telephones, no internet. So how do you maintain communications along great distances while still keeping it as secret as possible? Since there's going to be double agents, triple agents, like it's espionage central. Like that's part of
Mm.
that. It's not like today's world is that much more complex. It was super complex. I mean, code breaking, writing in, in invisible ink. There's so many cases of this during the time of the American Revolution, and it required cooperating with like-minded groups in Europe, in Russia, in India. Even there was a big uprising in India, coordinating with the American Continental Congress in 1780 against the British Empire, run by Hyder Ali, facilitated by some French diplomats, like Suffren, who was a major general friend of Ben Franklin, who was in India against the British Empire. You had it in Morocco as well, where the Moroccan Emperor Sidi Muhammad was arranging protection for American ships against Barbary pirates that were themselves deployed by the British Empire to carry out warfare on the seas.
So
So that's a lot of coordination. So part of, I think, the lodge system was to keep that type of secrecy as best maintained as possible. The other thing is that there are certain ideals about the brotherhood of man, of the age of reason, that many people believed we were close to back in those days of the late 18th century, that maybe it were possible to establish a society where it wouldn't just be cold logic, the way some of the Jacobins, like Robespierre, wanted. They had a very different idea of reason. Not all ideas of reason were also agreed upon, right? There's a lot of dispute about what is this thing called reason. Is it tied to morality and conscience, or is it purely logic? So, like a lot of the Girondins, for example, that took control of France after the bloodbath began and people started losing their heads. You had the emotional Jacobins on the one hand, who were like the voice of the mob, who had been disenfranchised, abused by the rich elites, who were turned into a mob sort of movement that killed everybody, good and bad alike. If you were rich, you would probably, good chance you would lose your head. And that would create a very foreseeable power vacuum, because now there's no leadership. So then the Girondins stepped in, who were like the logical, we want to rewrite the calendar to have a perfect decimal system of a 10-day calendar or a 10-day week and a perfect decimal based system. And we want, so that became a cult of logic, to the god of logic. And it became weird and a cult too, because then you had this weird like revival of pagan sun worship within this hyper logical movement. Strange. But that's often how it works. If you're too much logic sided, detached from a mediation of aesthetics and conscience and beauty and goodness, then you will easily fall to the opposite extreme of superstitious occultism, which is why you'll often find in historical movements things like radical Cartesians often also being radical alchemists, falling into hermetic shit. That's something you get with the Rosicrucians behind the Royal Society of Britain. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
Um,
So this is something like this. I consider myself to be very logical and very rational, and this is something that I have written about. I have not published it yet, but there's a lot of. So this will basically bring us to the second part of the podcast, if ever we get to debate on this on epistemology and logic. But yeah, let's put that for another day. But
yeah.
if I want to hook to that thing that you said before about the elites and the conspiracy of the creation of the United States, right? Because that was by definition, big conspiracy, people getting together and planning an event. And so my question in that context is, to what degree do you consider, say, geopolitics in particular, but also the events in history? Let's focus just on the 21st century, right? That's the most salient part for most of us. So to what degree do you consider the key events in the 21st century, that is, I don't know, say Iraq, Afghanistan, or today Ukraine, and so on, the result of collusion and conspiracy versus accidents and incompetence? And yeah, so what do you think?
It's a mixture. I mean, I don't think of anything as being simply one thing when it comes to the human agency behind events. You can't, because it's like, to make a 9/11 happen required a large degree of coordination, planning, foresight, but at the same time, it required a lot of people being stupid, being corrupt, taking bribes, looking the other way, not knowing what it was, that was not being on the inside joke. It required a lot of that too. So probably quantitatively more it involved more people being stupid and corrupt than being on the joke, the evil joke, so to speak. So it's a bit of a mixture, but they're not the ones who are causal in the process. So if you're
Yeah.
asking me what was causal, the motive agency, it's ideas and intentions that coordinate and plan, more so than randomness. I think randomness is usually a secondary, tertiary
Effect.
thing that we find, or corruption, or stupidity. It's always going to be there. There's an element of it, like, but but to give it more value when trying to ascertain a causal nexus is a prob. I think it's wrong to do that, to overinflate its value or role in understanding historical processes.
That's an amazing way to put it. So if I were to summarize it in my own words, the way you put it is the majority of the people involved were just incompetent, not in on the inside game and so on. However, the majority of influence swayed was done in a coordinated, conspiratorial manner, so to speak. That's great. I love that. I love that answer. So I have another one, which you also alluded to, which is a nice continuation of that. And this one is from my mom, who apparently knew of you long before I read of your works. And she asks, what do you think is what do you think is the role of the British Empire in what's happening today?
Oh, it's pretty big.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Canada. I'm speaking to you from Canada. And Canada's our head of state is not Justin Trudeau. It's legally speaking, it is the
The Queen?
Governor General.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's legally it. And the Governor General is the active agency of the Crown in Canada. If each province has a premier, but the premier is actually not the legal head of the province. It's the lieutenant governors who are installed in each province. And you'll usually find, if you could, anyone can carry out this exercise going back to a century or more. You'll usually find that they're members of the order of they're Knights of Saint John of Jerusalem.
Oh, wow, okay. I
Yeah,
was thinking more along the lines of they're members of the MI6 or the 77th Brigade, or people like Hamish de Breton Gordon, or whatever his operative name was, whom you find in Syria, whom you find today in Ukraine, and everywhere there is dirt.
yeah, you'll get that, but these are newer institutions. I find that it's more useful to have like a mapping in the mind of the hierarchy of institutions that go back even before Britain became an empire.
Interesting.
Because England wasn't always an empire. There was a humanist, anti-imperial tradition very active inside of England, especially that arose brilliantly during the early stages of the Golden Renaissance, where you had Henry VII, who reestablished the Tudors back into a position of dominance. And that was around the 1480s or something. Anyway, England was a bastion of the first really modern sovereign nation state that saw the purpose of the idea of a king, or the idea of laws emanated by a king, and economic, political, cultural, as being tied to the idea of the general welfare, that a king only is a servant of the people, as a concept that was pretty fresh.
Is
Not a
that
lot of kings believe that.
is,
um,
is that around the 13th century that you're talking about?
I'm
Like with
talking
the
about
Magna Carta?
1480s or
Oh,
so.
okay, later. Okay, okay.
I mean, the idea was there. We had it with Charlemagne and his advisors around Alcuin as well earlier on, in like early ninth century, late eighth century. This concept, and it goes back to ancient times, right? This idea of the philosopher king, right? It's a noble aspiration that people would hope to achieve, but very rare. It's very rare that some individual could be organized, who is born into a position of power, or attains it by other means, but usually it's whether you're born into it, and has the good fortune of having good advisors, good mentors to help them discover their conscience properly and how they relate to themselves in a healthy, mature manner. That's very rare. Usually there it's unfortunate, but princes and princelings and people who are born into noble families usually have handlers, have flatterers. They're like, Justin Trudeau's an example of a low-level sort of modern princeling born into a little modern noble family in Canada. His father it was made into sort of like what you could consider almost like a demi-godhead in the zeitgeist of the baby boomers, of Canadians. That's actually, I kid you not. So his life from an early age was very controlled. He was always given flatterers, people who would just never tell him the truth. And so I feel you have to feel bad for these types of people. And that's been most of history, people born into a family that would be expected to rule. So why am I saying this on the Britain for your mom's answer? So that for her question, England was infiltrated, especially with a foolish king, Henry VIII, who was the second son of Henry VII. Henry VII died at a moment which was super strategic. One of these pregnant moments I was telling you about, like we're living through now.
Yeah, what
There was a
was that?
really 1509,
Okay,
and that was a moment when
just testing you.
yeah, it was a moment when the warring nations of Europe finally stopped fighting long enough. And this took a lot of coordination, a lot of planning, years of conspiracy to get everyone to let go of their egos long enough to have a conversation and to create an alliance that became known as the League of Cambrai. Um, and that league ended up realizing, hey, we've all been fighting each other, we're all backstabbing each other, and we're all using information that seems to be coming from the Venetian ambassadors that are active in all of our courts. They're like, wait a minute. The only people that seem to have been benefiting from all of these wars seem to be these bankers in Venice, which are, I mean, Venice was, like I said earlier on, I alluded to it, it was the center of control, influence of much of the geopolitical terrain globally, including stretching all the way down to the Venetian traders who were advising the Khans, the Mongolian hordes. People like Marco Polo, his father, were just a few of the very influential Venetian traders who became advisors to Ogadai Khan. It was only the Venetians who were allowed to have full access to the trade routes that were dominated by the Mongolians. And yet these Mongolians were able to then just become this horde, kind of like a proto ISIS that could be deployed to subvert nations that rival countries you don't like. And I think that in my hypothesis, it was likely the case that the Venetians were providing some of their very high quality intelligence from the courts, going all the way to Russia into India, Baghdad, Northern Africa, everywhere the Venetians were, they had a very highly integrated, very well organized, mature but evil embassy system of espionage. So all that to say, the when the League of Cambrai, it destroyed Venice. It destroyed the Venetian entire defenses. All of their ships were destroyed by the League. Um, but then before they could go and finish the job and completely wipe Venice off the map, unfortunately, there was a weird operation where Venice bribed the Pope Julius II to take on, like, this huge. He got a lot of money by selling. I'm not going to go into the details, but it has to do with some of the properties that he had access to that the Venetians were able to raise the price of some of the alum to like 10 times the market value, and that made a huge profit, and do a few other gifts like restore some papal states. And all of a sudden, within like a month, the Rome and the Vatican took became the allies of Venice, and they took with them the entire Holy Roman Empire as well, of Maximilian, who would do whatever Rome said. And all of a sudden, these former allies of France and England and Florence and Milan became all of a sudden their enemies, as they were allied now with honest, noble Venice. And everybody started attacking France and Florence. And this is where the story of, like, Da Vinci having to escape to save his life, and where he went from Florence to France at the end of his life. It was around that time of the sabotage of the League of Cambrai. But the thing about the League of Cambrai was that it was a wake-up call for the Venetian oligarchs, because they realized they're not as strategic or secure in their position as they thought that they were, and they had to figure out a way to migrate their position, their basing operations, to something a little bit more strategic. England fit the bill nicely. Amsterdam fit the bill nicely, on an island far enough removed from mainland disputes. So that became the new focus that animated the next several, I would almost say a couple of centuries nearly, to infiltrate and expel or destroy the dynamics that were represented by people like Thomas More, Erasmus. The Henry VII dynamic had to be expelled. Henry VII's youngest son, or first son, his eldest son, who was the heir, Arthur, who would have been King Arthur, he died a mysterious death. He was like 18. He died a really mysterious death at the same time as his father died, leaving the way for um, Henry VIII to become the guy who had a had a lot of problems. And he was worked on quite a bit by the court flatterers. He ended up trusting somebody named Francesco Zorzi, who was at the time a leading Kabbalist from Venice, a Venetian monk from a very high family. The Zorzi family is still to this very day a very, very influential family in grand strategy. People can just Google that. Zorzi, Zorzi. So that was he was known as the sort of top early proto Rosicrucian. He created a Kabbalistic sort of, or he was part of a Kabbalistic Gnosticism, or that was centered in Venice. He became the advisor both to the papacy as well as to Henry VIII about how do you create a new type of, or how do you respond to Henry VIII's desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry a new chick, Anne Boleyn. And the great idea was, well, just make your own religion, or make your own faction of the church with you as the head.
I should do that too.
Yeah. Well, the thing about that was it was never necessary. Kings had already there was many cases of kings having divorced. You're the king, you make the rules, so you didn't have to make your own faction of the church. That just fell right into the divide to conquer, splintering up Christianity to facilitate more forever wars. So he fell into that, and with Zorzi though, and also that's where Thomas More lost his head, because Thomas More was one of the last real serious points of resistance. And the corruption and the creation of more of these esoteric secret societies took control of the courts, of the scientific management of England, of the political expressions, and the Rosicrucians of John Dee, Francis Bacon, who were all leading, alchemists following the Hermetic sort of teachings, were all, and also following Zorzi. They were all followers. They all knew Zorzi. Robert Flood, Elias Ashmole, who created the today's Ashmolean Museum, very important strategic center even today. They created the Royal Society, the British Royal Society, that originally, if you look at the original experiments being done by the British Royal Society, they were like, it's mostly magic and witchcraft, like where they're trying to see what type of incantation you need to make to keep a spider within a circle that you draw on a certain type of wooden surface. Weird shit, And this is what Jonathan Swift actually later on, who's advising a better government in 1690s, early 1700s under Robert Harley. Jonathan Swift, who's known as a playwright, actually is polemicizing against this superstitious witchcraft in the Royal Society within his Gulliver's Travels in the island of Laputa. He's actually, this is documentable, but he's advising the government. So you have this attempt a century later, after all this mess is happening I just talked about, to restore some idea that England can avoid becoming an empire. Unfortunately, this is under the period of Queen Anne, from about 1701 to 1710. Very short period, brief potential, but it's undone. Everybody who plays a positive role ends up either going into the Tower of London, getting killed, or getting expelled, and then from there, England really embraces, without any moral leadership, its new identity to become the empire, and to gain control of more and more of the world, and do what the Western Roman Empire failed to do a millennia earlier, which was become the unipolar world power, dominating the world from a central point of command, with an inner elite who are at the governing structure, right? So Britain became the empire. It didn't disappear. We were told that it disappeared after World War II. When you look at it from the standpoint of what I'm saying, instead of just the popular notion of the British Empire is like
the political structure.
Guys, yeah, just the funny hats, red jackets. It's not that. It was this more deeper thing that is also tied to banking. The city of London, then in the 18th century, just like today, is a global nerve center of global finance. And it doesn't mean that everybody working in the city, and I'm talking about the city within a city, right? The private sort of corporation of the city of London. I don't mean that they know that what they're doing. Most people, like I was saying with the Freemasons, have no idea. They're just, they're monetarists trying to make a buck with money. They're trying to make money. They don't know. They're not in on the inside joke, but it is a nerve center, and for those who control the operating system, it is, and it was back in the American Revolution, and it never disappeared. Just like today, um, a center of economic warfare. It's today, what's been added to it are the British offshore Cayman Islands accounts, which are very important for money laundering, providing money for the support of terrorism. That's been the entire 20th century and still today, creating shell companies that would then cover different types of black budget operations that were tied to intelligence, overseen by intelligence, operations that provided also support to the the drug culture, the drug trafficking, and the crime syndicates. Were always appendages, whether the Bronfmans in Canada, whether the Green Gang in Taiwan, whatever. They were always managed as local, necessary, controlled crime syndicates, the mafia, the Italian or Corsican or Sicilian mafias, or the Jewish mafias of Marilansky. These are all necessary components of a broader machinery. They were never a thing unto themselves. And that you can get that by looking at the fact that like Samuel Bronfman, who was part of like a newer sort of local mini mercenary family, was made a knight of the Order of Bath. Like that's something you give those knighthoods over to those who make the biggest risks on behalf of the British Empire. It's granted by the monarchy. So there's all of these things that people should hold in their mind when they're trying to get a little bit of a mapping over how the British Empire rebranded itself after World War II. It didn't disappear. Most of the people who wanted to make the British Empire disappear, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, who had a grand vision with many allies around the world, including inside of Washington, they had a vision of ending empire through help utilizing the power of the sovereign nation state to assist in the development of all nations of the world through industrial progress, sharing the fruits of scientific discoveries with everybody. That was the vision. Creating a new type of economic and banking framework that would give every nation the rights to control their economic destinies. That ended when Roosevelt died way too early, probably killed, and there was never an autopsy. So if anybody says, oh, it was a brain aneurysm or it was a heart attack, there was never an autopsy. So no, I mean, I trust, in this
Your gut.
case, huh?
You trust your gut?
I trust my gut, and I trust also Stalin went on record saying to Roosevelt's son, like, "Look, Churchill's people killed your father," and
Oh.
Roosevelt's son wrote, published this for obvious reasons. And all of Roosevelt's allies were purged, and all of the deep state, which was waiting in the wings, a lot of Rhodes scholars, a lot of Fabians who were in the State Department, who were tied to what became the CIA, which was brought online, governed by MI6. They took over under Harry Truman. Bombs were dropped on defeated countries like Japan unnecessarily as an assertion of a new set of rules of the game and a message to Russia, to China, that the idea of a world of cooperating nation states is not going to happen anymore. There's a new rule of might makes right that we're going to reassert, and we have the nuclear bomb. So, you know, um, and that became the governing process of what made the U.S. more stupid, more controlled by this foreign apparatus during the Cold War. The FBI played a role. Allen Dulles, the CIA, played a role in overseeing the murder of certain obstructive influences like Kennedy or his brother Robert F. Kennedy or Fred Hampton or Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. Like there was every time that there was like a moral light that arose with conscience to like awaken people to the memory of what America should have been or was in its origin, they had to be snuffed out. And so I think that coincided with things like COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, the entire like targeting of or moving the warfare against America from the domain of conventional military warfare that the British had been running
To
for
our
a long
brains.
time into more the domain of the mind, culture
Yeah.
wars, and making the people become willing slaves or participants to their own destruction instead of it being a physical attack from the outside. And so that's sort of I think the wake of what we're living through. But back to your mom's point, the British Empire is still alive and well,
Yeah.
but it's not what people thought it was.
Well, thank you for that very concise historical detour of an answer. I'm assuming you want to go soon. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask one last personal question. Should be a short one, which I came about, and I think you sent it. Yeah, you sent it to me via email. Thank you for that, by the way. And for everyone listening, you should go check out Matt's publications on CanadianPatriot.org. But one of the things that I saw from your publications is that report you co-author with your wife. And so my question to you is, where do you get such a wife, and where may I find one of these?
Yeah, I got really lucky. I guess you're referring to the Breaking Free of Anti-China Psyops.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, we did 2 of those, and no, yeah, she's brilliant. You know, yeah, we were both originally. If you're asking me like where I met my wife, I guess it's important, I think, to become friends before one becomes romantically involved. I would say that because I have a lot of people I know were frustrated because like they love ideas, they care about geopolitics, but their spouse female just doesn't care, and it creates, sometimes you got kids, sometimes it creates a lot of stress, especially if, let's say, there's a pressure to get
vaccinated.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
families have been ripped apart by that. So much damage has been done. And it's like, it didn't have to happen if there was already a common wavelength of like understanding that we both we don't care as much about the same things, but we both agree on certain points of principle that would have allowed the bypassing of these types of terrible disputes that have torn families apart. So I don't know. Like, I mean, for me and Cynthia, we were lucky because we chose to take it very slowly. I mean, we knew each other for like 6 years before that. We focused on just friendship for a very long time. I presumed that we were not going to get together, and she presumed the same thing. And it just happened that in building friendships, we're like, okay, also, you're beautiful, and we have common passion, so let's take it to the next level. But there was a lot of bumps in the road too. But all that to say, I think focus on friendship first, build friendships that are lasting, and surround yourself, because a lot of people get too focused with the cultural expectations from family and culture to get a girlfriend, get a boyfriend, get married, have a family, and there's a lot of pressure, and sometimes we jump too fast. We let this pressure result in making premature decisions that we don't have to do. So just being happy with yourself, like just focus on loving ideas, on just being happy, loving ideas, being passionate about ideas that are immortal, that are universal, that are, and just letting that resonate. And you'll find that you'll try to surround yourself with good people. Like look for people who will make you a better person, right? And in that attitude, you will tend to find an environment that you will have a different set of options that will just appear, rather than you going out looking for who's the right mate for me on a dating app or something, which often it sometimes it works, but often it doesn't. Usually it doesn't work so well.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that answer. Thank you for your time. Is there anything else you'd want to shout out or advertise?
No, I guess we'll talk about some science and maybe have a bit of a fun, healthy dispute in the next one. So I won't talk about my science book, but I guess if people want to dig a little bit more deeply into some of what I've just said in a summary fashion, my Clash of the Two Americas book series, volumes 1 to 4, is a good place to start. I tried to make a lot of this stuff as detailed as I can without going into over detail. So it's still, I'm trying to like take people through a lot of rather complex history, but in a hopefully entertaining, as simple a way as possible. As well as the untold history of Canada for people who might be listening and they're Canadians and they're like, but I live in a democracy. What are you talking about? I wrote a 4-volume book series called The Untold History of Canada, which will blow your mind, I hope. And there's a lot of good people, like a lot of great heroes that have been written out of our Canadian history books, which I try to showcase as much as I can, their fight, their sacrifice. Wonderful people who we've just been not allowed to know about, or if we've been told about their names, it's in some derogatory way. But when you look at what they did, like everything good that we enjoy in Canada, as far as being a first world country, didn't happen because the British Empire gave it to us. It happened through a fight.
Yeah.
And so some of those battles we showcase, or I showcase in the books.
Amazing. All right. Thank you very much, Matt. I'll put, as I said, the link to your website below. And I guess we'll hear from each other again.
Sounds good. All right.
Thank you, man. Have a nice evening.
There you go.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.